All right, so today we're diving into something a bit different, a deep dive into Philippine employment law, and specifically redundancy. And no, I don't mean like when I repeat myself, though. I'm sure I do that sometimes.
Cycle.
But this is about what happens when, a company decides, hey, this job, it's just not needed anymore. And to
Right.
like really get into it, we're looking at a real case, a 2019 Supreme Court ruling. So high stakes stuff.
Yeah, it's a situation you can imagine leads to disputes pretty often.
Oh, for sure.
Businesses, they need to be able to change, adapt, and sadly, sometimes that means people lose their jobs.
Right.
But on the flip side, Philippine law is there to protect workers from being unfairly dismissed.
Makes sense.
So it all boils down to, when is it legit? When is redundancy a real reason to let someone go?
And that's where this case comes in. We've got two guys, Noli Aparicio and Renan Clarito. They were radio technicians for, this is a mouthful, Manila Broadcasting Company, MBC for short.
Okay.
And they worked at this relay station, FFES Bacolod, in, Bacolod City, broadcasting DZRH. Pretty big station.
Right.
But here's where it gets kind of crazy.
So NBC, they decided to shake things up a bit. Yeah. Implemented this program, hating kapatid, sibling rivalry, basically.
Wow.
The idea was each station, it had to stand on its own 2 feet, financially speaking.
Okay, so each of them had to be, profitable on their own.
Exactly. Responsible for their own revenue, expenses, the whole shebang. And that meant some stations, especially the ones they considered, redundant.
Redundant. What does that even mean in this context?
So in this case, they basically decided that FFES Bacolod, it wasn't essential. See, listeners in Bacolod, they could already get DZRH clear as day from another station, bigger one, over in Iloilo.
Oh, so they figured, why have two stations when one will do, kind of a thing.
Exactly. FFES Bacolod, it was, in their eyes, redundant.
So because of this whole hating kapatid thing, and
Yeah.
because they labeled FFES Bacolod as redundant, NBC decided to just shut it down.
Yeah.
And Noli and Renan, our radio technicians, they were let go.
That's right.
Which, I mean, I get it from a business perspective maybe, but it doesn't seem very fair to them. So they decided to take NBC to court over it, right?
They did, and that's where things get really interesting because, it didn't stop there. First stop was the labor arbiter.
Ah, okay. For those of us who aren't experts in Philippine labor law, what exactly is a labor arbiter?
Think of them like a judge. But their courtroom is, the world of labor disputes.
Okay, so they hear both sides, employee and employer, and then make a decision.
Exactly. They're the referee in all this.
Yeah.
And in Noli and Renan's case, the labor arbiter actually sided with them, said that NBC shutting down FFES Bacolod and letting them go wasn't justified.
Wow, so a win for the little guy. Or at least a start, right?
You could say that.
But I'm guessing NBC didn't just accept that decision, did they?
Of course not. This is a big company. They appealed the decision, took it up to the National Labor Relations Commission, the NLRC.
Another mouthful.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But basically, they're like the big leagues for labor disputes. They review what the labor arbiter decided and can agree, disagree, or even change things up.
And in Noli and Renan's case, what happened? Did the NLRC side with the labor arbiter?
Actually, no, they didn't. The NLRC overturned the decision and ruled in favor of NBC.
Oh, wow. So now it's a win for NBC. What was their reasoning? I mean, why overturn it? So the NLRC sided with NBC.
They did?
What was their reasoning for overturning the initial decision? I mean, it seemed pretty clear-cut from the labor arbiter.
Well, the NLRC basically agreed that NBC had a good reason, a business reason, for shutting down FFES Bacolod.
Okay.
They said that this hating kapatid program, maybe it was tough on some stations, but it was NBC's call to make.
Right.
They emphasized that companies, they have the right to make these decisions, strategic decisions, even if it means closing a station, making some positions redundant.
Okay, that makes sense.
No, they have to be able to adapt to survive.
I get it, but what about Noli and Renan? Did the NLRC just disregard their side completely?
Not exactly. It's not like redundancy gives an employer a free pass to do whatever they want.
Right, of course.
There are procedures, there are specific things employers have to do to make sure everything is above board.
So they have to prove that it was necessary and that they did it properly.
Exactly.
Okay.
The NLRC really dug into whether NBC acted reasonably, did they follow the rules, all that.
So it sounds like there are two things at play here.
Yeah.
Was the redundancy genuine? Like, did they really not need that station anymore? And did the company go about it the right way?
Exactly. That's what it boils down to.
Okay, so what did they find, about NBC?
Well, they looked at whether NBC really needed to shut down FFES Bacolod and if they thought about other options for Noli and Renan.
Like, could they have moved them to the Iloilo station?
Right. Or were there any other open positions they might have been qualified for?
And did NBC do that? Did they try to find them other positions?
The NLRC thought so.
Okay.
They said NBC showed they looked into those options, and because Noli and Renan were specifically radio technicians, there just weren't any other suitable positions at the time.
So even though they lost their jobs, at least it wasn't a completely heartless decision. I mean, NBC had to justify their actions.
Exactly. There has to be a justification. It can't just be random.
Right.
And just so you know, it didn't end with the NLRC, Noli and Renan. They appealed again, this time to the Court of Appeals.
Oh, wow. So they weren't giving up.
Not at all.
Another layer to this whole legal process.
Yep.
What happened at the Court of Appeals? Did they agree with the NLRC or did they see things differently?
The Court of Appeals took a long, hard look at everything. And in the end, they upheld the NLRC's decision, ruled in favor of NBC again.
Wow. So twice now NBC's actions have been looked at by the courts and twice they've come out on top.
Yeah.
Did the Court of Appeals give any more insight into their thought process?
They did, actually.
Okay.
While they agreed with the NLRC, they really stressed how important it is that when companies choose employees for redundancy, the criteria, it has to be fair. It has to be reasonable, you know?
Yeah, it makes sense.
It can't be some arbitrary decision. There needs to be a clear reason behind who stays and who goes.
I'm glad to hear that. Even though Noli and Renan lost, at least it seems like the court, they get it. They understand that employees need to be protected from unfair treatment, even during something like a company restructuring.
Exactly. They emphasize that a lot.
Okay.
And it highlights something really crucial for anyone listening who might be in a similar situation.
Okay.
Often, the employee, they're the ones who have to prove that their dismissal was unfair, unreasonable, and that's not always easy.
So it sounds like even if you think you've been unfairly let go because of redundancy, it's really hard to prove that in court.
Yeah, that's the tough part. Even though there are laws to protect employees, actually proving it, well,
It's an uphill battle.
it can be. Gathering evidence, especially if you're trying to prove the employer didn't act fairly, that's not easy.
No, I imagine not. What kind of evidence are we even talking about?
Think about it. Maybe you need internal company documents.
Yeah.
Something showing they didn't really explore other options.
Right.
Or maybe there's a pattern of discrimination. Or those redundancy criteria weren't applied fairly to everyone.
So basically, you almost have to be a lawyer just to understand how to fight back.
It's definitely complex, and it makes you think about the power dynamics between an employer and an employee, especially when a company's restructuring. You know, it can feel like David and Goliath.
Absolutely.
And for Noli and Renan, this wasn't even the end of the road. They decided to appeal one last time
Oh, wow, really?
to the highest court in the Philippines, the Supreme Court.
Wow, they were really determined. I mean, that must have been so draining for them, emotionally, financially, but I guess they felt it was important to fight for their jobs.
Absolutely.
So what did the Supreme Court decide? Did they agree with the lower courts?
They did. They sided with NBC, upheld the previous rulings.
Oh, wow.
But it's not like they were completely dismissive of the fairness issue.
Okay, what do you mean?
They reiterated that companies, yes, they can restructure, they can even close parts of their businesses, but it's not a free-for-all.
So there are limits. Even if something's technically legal, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, ethically speaking.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head.
Did the Supreme Court give any more guidance on that, on how companies should approach redundancy ethically?
They stress that when choosing who to let go, the criteria, it's got to be crystal clear, objective, and applied fairly across the board.
That makes sense. So no playing favorites or using wishy-washy criteria to target certain people.
Exactly. Should always be about the business needs, a real assessment of the roles and the skills needed within the company.
Okay, that's good to know.
It is.
So to wrap this whole thing up, it seems like even though NBC won, legally speaking, it brings up a lot of questions about how companies should handle redundancy.
For sure. This case, it really shows how complicated redundancy is in Philippine employment law.
It really does. It's not always black and white.
Exactly. There are a lot of gray areas.
And I think what gets lost sometimes behind all the legal jargon, the court dates, it's that there are real people affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. Their livelihoods are on the line.
For sure. It's not just a theoretical exercise. It's people's lives.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, I think this has been a really insightful deep dive. Thank you so much for breaking it all down for us.
Of course, happy to be here.
And for our listeners, keep those questions coming, keep learning. The world's a complicated place, and we're all just trying to navigate